Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Coach Wilson, and welcome to Unit 9, Day 6. Today's journal, we're going to be talking about 3 ways that the peace treaties were unsuccessful during World War I. Remember, we're talking about United States history, so you need to include United States process, okay? Don't go looking up other things on Google. Make sure you use Day 5 notes. Now, today we're going to be talking about post-war adjustments. So how is the United States adjusting to all of the effects of World War I on the economy and on everything that has happened? Now, what was the lasting effects of the war on America? That's kind of what I was talking about there in the beginning. Now, the Red Scare in the United States. One of the most important things that we can talk about from the 1920s on to about the 1950s is Russia's influence in the United States. Now, obviously, it's going to continue from the 1920s all the way to really about the 1980s, but specifically the 20s through the 50s, you're going to see a lot of influence of people afraid of communism, afraid of Russia being involved in various things. It's always interesting, even now, that Russia still has an influence in our economy and our society. Now, there was a series of labor strikes and terrorist attacks in the United States, and it convinced many people that the Reds, quote unquote, Russians, were about to take over. A strike in Seattle, workers walked off their jobs and joined other workers from industries in a strike. It crippled the industry, trade, and delivery of essential services in Seattle, Washington for 5 days. Remember, that's Washington up in the northwest of the United States, not Washington, D.C., okay? Make sure you understand where Seattle's at. This convinced many Americans that the United States was on the brink of revolution. So what we're afraid of is that we're not 100 but 150 years removed from the Revolutionary War. Is it going to happen again? Or are we going to have another uprising? Many corporations use the threat of communism as a reason to break up the strike, so they could say that these are communists, they're trying to destroy our economy. Well, then the government gets behind it, and then it doesn't look so bad that you're trying to stop these people from advocating for better rights for their wages, better rights for benefits, things of that nature. There was also a Boston police strike in which 19 police officers fired for their union activity, and because they were fired for being involved in a union, the whole force voted to strike and just completely went on strike. And so you can imagine what that would do to completely take away an entire police service in a big city like that. Now, Calvin Coolidge, governor of Massachusetts, said there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. And he actually received national attention for his firm stand on the police walkout. And his idea was that even though these police maybe felt that they were being mistreated in firing these 19 police officers, he still felt that they should have stayed and done their job because it was, the right thing to do for public safety. Now, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer is going to lead what we call the Palmer Raids, and he sets up this anti-radical division to raid suspected radical organizations, and we're going to see kind of another form of the Palmer Raids later on with McCarthy in the 1950s. Foreigners were targeted, and over 500 were deported without any formal charges. So, any type of person that we felt, could be a threat to our economy or our way of life or our government, we just deported them. In 1920, the New York State Assembly expelled 5 socialist members, even though they had been legally elected and had not violated any laws or rules. So now, just for being a socialist, you could be voted out or moved. And to be honest, guys, it's kind of interesting to correlate that to today's society, because right now we have a lot of people that are calling the Democratic Party socialist, and Democrat Party's calling Republicans Nazis. Like, it's almost like we're living in like this sub era of the 1940s and 30s, when people were very much name calling and trying to accuse people of these quote unquote un-American activities. The same as what's going on in here, and they called them Bolsheviks, referring to them being from Europe and Russia, and basically they used these terms and called them un-American just to crush any legislation they didn't like. So it's kind of like, somebody does something wrong to you, and they really haven't done anything wrong to get fired at your job, but you say, hey, he's a communist, I saw him speaking to 5 socialists over there, they're a known socialist group. Well, then that guy gets fired because you made up some story. That's how bad it was. Other things were crushed because of this, including Social Security, unemployment insurance, and state-supported housing initiatives. So very much of the reforms that you see Franklin Roosevelt kind of promote there in the 1930s while we're going through the Great Depression, you see some of that same things going on here during this time of, like, they can't pass that legislation because people don't want to do it, so they just call it quote unquote Russian. Now, going back to how immigrants are being treated and how we're kind of looking at foreigners, Seiko and Vanzetti, all right, they were these two men, and essentially they were Italian immigrants, and apparently there was a gunman who had robbed and killed a guard and a paymaster at a shoe factory in Massachusetts, who fit the description of Niccolo Seiko and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Both were carrying guns at the time when they were arrested, and that were the same model as the ones in the crime. So, they appeared to be the same guys that had robbed this factory. Now, the problem was they were convicted without much evidence, and it was believed that the conviction was actually more about their heritage and the fact that they just fit the description as being an Italian immigrant than actually being, the guys that did it. They did admit to be an anarchist. That also kind of played a role in conviction, and that just means that they don't believe in like a central government, that people should just be able to govern themselves and there should be no central government or anything of that nature. Appeals went on for years, but unfortunately for them, in 1927 they were electrocuted. Bartolomeo Vanzetti made this statement: "This is our career and our triumph. Never in our full life could we hope to do such work for tolerance, for justice, for man's understanding of man as we now do by accident." Now, isolationism is going to return during this period as a result of the Red Scare and just, Congress and the United States not wanting to be involved in all of these European affairs. Nativism is back on the rise, which you can imagine why, trying to keep out these immigrants. The same thing that we did, if you see the picture on the right, the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had the Japanese Exclusion Act, and all these things that went on. The U.S. is going to start limiting immigration again. Laws excluded entire Asian families, even set up quotas for certain nationalities of how many of that nationality could come in. So immigration was, swelling after the war because we were very helpful in the war. We had also kind of stepped in and shown that we had some power and some force, and that we were, kind of a country that promoted freedom and democracy. Well, that's causing immigration to rise in our country, and Congress was afraid of that, and so they felt like they had to react, and that was the way they did. Women's rights is also growing during this time. We talked about that in Unit 8. Large amounts of women did not flock to the polls, however, after the 19th Amendment was passed, so they get women the right to vote, and women don't just flock to the polls. And the media is just focused on the lack of attendance, not the fact that women can vote and that some women have taken the power to vote, but they're focused on they didn't go out to the polls in mass numbers. Why did we make such a big deal out of this? Alice Paul is going to continue to fight for a national or for an Equal Rights Amendment, an ERA, or what is called the ERA, and she runs the National Woman's Party. Okay, and they're going to continue to fight for women getting, the same rights as a man, whether it's equal pay, equal treatment, whatever that may be. Now, African Americans are also migrating during this time. Something like 500,000 African Americans moved to the north during the war. Many of these factories and job opportunities were there for them, and it gave a lot of these African Americans who, aren't but 50, 60 years removed from slavery now a chance to find a new way of life, especially, if you're in your 40s. Your parents were probably slaves if you're an African American. So for you, this may be a chance for you to move your now new family of your kids and your wife somewhere where you're not on a farm, or you're not doing sharecropping, or you're not having to rely on farm labor, and you could maybe get into an industry and a job and create a career. The problem was African Americans did not escape discrimination moving north. It actually still remained there, because the same problem with immigrants is the same problem with African Americans coming to the north, is that these people that are working these factories, they want to strike, but when these factories bring in African Americans and immigrants to replace them as scabs or as, strike breakers, then it upset them at these people. So they're upset at African Americans and immigrants mainly because they're taking their jobs. It's the same principle, just in a different way. Because of all the discrimination, you're going to start to see race riots. Many of these communities were very diversified now. There's a lot bigger portion of African American people as well as other cultures. And specifically in Illinois, D.C., and other northern cities, you're going to see these race riots, but some of the worst were actually in Chicago. And you're actually going to see some of those even in North Carolina. Wilmington, we didn't get to talk about it, but Wilmington had a big race riot, I believe it was in 1904. And so there's a lot going on in our country during this time. You also have the Harlem Renaissance. This kind of shows that same idea I was telling you, that the African American community was growing in the North, and the African American population rose from 14,000 in 1914 to 200,000 by 1930. Literary life among African Americans flourished. Jazz flourished. Hundreds of novels and other writings were printed, including one that was called The New Negro by Alain Locke. And many of these books and different things just promoted African Americans beyond what they had ever been promoted. It's kind of like now African Americans are getting opportunities because of the war and the expansion of industry and all these things that they've never had before, because the United States is growing, and growth promotes opportunity. Now, Warren Harding becomes president following Woodrow Wilson, and he's going to win the presidential election of 1920, and he wants a return to normalcy. That was his goal. It was what he ran on his campaign. He was very anti-internationalism, so against the League of Nations, which means he was very much promoting isolationism among Americans. He was anti-progressive, meaning he was against, women's right to vote, and this whole progressive movement of where ideals and morals and values are changing. Very, very pro-business. So he's almost kind of a step back to one of those presidents prior to Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt obviously was very antitrust. Warren G. Harding is going to be kind of a step back towards kind of those old school presidents there of the late 1800s. Americans wanted a return to isolationism, and his support of big business is going to kind of follow in suit with American ideals, because America wants to grow, but it wants to grow away from having to help anybody else. It's almost kind of like someone who's a little bit selfish. That's really what America's like during this time. Unfortunately for Harding, he's going to put many of his friends and political supporters into his cabinet, and these men will become known as the Ohio Gang, and Harding had run with many of these state level officials in Ohio. And so these political supporters and men are going to become a part of his cabinet, and you're almost seeing kind of this idea of patronage, which we ended, a couple, 20 years before. The problem is that many of these men were politicians, so they had the ability to do this, but they may not have been the right people for the job. This is going to earn him quite a bad reputation. However, he did actually put some good people into the cabinet. Because they will actually remain in office after he dies of a heart attack a few years later. So Harding dies, and these people actually continue to stay in the cabinet. They're not fired or replaced. Now, one of the biggest things that goes on under Harding's presidency, and this goes back to his cabinet members and why the Ohio Gang was viewed very negatively, they were involved in a lot of scandals. They were accused of stealing government funds, taking payments from big businesses. Two even committed suicide from the pressure of just what was, being put onto them about were they involved in illegal activities. And then we have the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who was bribed to lease U.S. Navy land, which contained oil reserves it was this Teapot Dome Oil Company. And basically, that's where the Teapot Dome scandal name comes from. But this is regarded as one of the biggest scandals in American history up until Watergate. And what happens is he had leased this land, which was supposed to be, the United States land, like it was the country's land, but he leased it to an oil company. And essentially, the Supreme Court investigates it. It's investigated by the Senate as well. And Fall's going to go to prison in 1929. But they had trouble proving it. But the Teapot oil fields, I believe, were shut down until the 1970s, something like that. But it's just more proof that there's a lot of corruption in the government during this time, and there's going to be a lot of corruption in the government, from the 1880s up until this point. When we get to Roosevelt, a lot of that corruption disappears for a period of time, and a lot of that has to do with World War II and the Depression. But Harding does die 2.5 years into his office, leaving cool Calvin Coolidge to deal with the bulk of all of his problems. And we'll talk about Silent Cal here in just a day or so. So remember, here to get your vocabulary, here's the Red Scare, Seiko and Vanzetti, and the Harlem Renaissance. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.